The morning sun cast a golden glow over the grounds of Windsor Castle as Queen Camilla prepared for what should have been a routine royal engagement. She stood before her mirror, adjusting the elegant sapphire brooch on her cream-colored coat dress. Today marked her 3rd month as queen consort, and she was still learning the intricate dance of royal protocol that had taken Diana years to master, and Catherine seemed to perform effortlessly, her lady-in-waiting. Margaret, a woman in her late 50s, with kind eyes and decades of palace experience, stood nearby with a leather-bound folder containing the day's schedule. The Queen had several appointments, but the most important was the annual inspection of the household cavalry at their barracks in central London. It was a tradition that stretched back generations. Camilla was determined to execute it flawlessly. As her car glided through the London streets, Camilla reviewed her notes. She had spent the previous evening studying the names of senior officers, memorizing faces from photographs, and practicing the proper way to acknowledge military salutes. Charles had offered advice over dinner, his voice gentle but firm, as he reminded her that the military took their traditions seriously. Very seriously indeed. The household cavalry barracks came into view, its Victorian architecture standing proud against the modern cityscape. As the royal vehicle approached the gates, Camilla could see rows of soldiers standing at attention, their ceremonial uniforms immaculate, their boots polished to a mirror shine. The sight was impressive, almost intimidating, and she felt a flutter of nervousness in her stomach that she quickly suppressed. Colonel James Hartwick, a decorated officer with 30 years of service, waited at the entrance. His posture was ramrod straight, his uniform adorned with medals that caught the light. He had served under 3 monarchs and had witnessed countless royal visits. His reputation for maintaining the highest standards of military discipline was legendary throughout the armed forces. Camilla stepped from the car with practiced grace, her smile warm and genuine. The colonel saluted sharply, and she nodded in acknowledgement, just as she had been taught. So far, everything was proceeding according to plan. The wind carried the faint scent of polish and leather. Mixing with the crisp autumn air, they walked together through the barracks, the colonel explaining the history of various regiments, pointing out photographs of past ceremonies, and introducing her to officers who bowed respectfully. Camilla found herself genuinely interested, asking questions about the soldiers' training and their experiences. She had always believed in showing authentic interest rather than merely performing duty. Then they entered the main parade ground, where over 200 soldiers stood in perfect formation. The sight took Camilla's breath away. The precision, the discipline, the sheer presence of so many dedicated servicemen and women created an atmosphere of solemn grandeur. This was the heart of British military tradition, and she was about to inspect them. Colonel Hartwick briefed her on the procedure. She would walk along the front row, he explained, and he would accompany her. The soldiers would remain at attention unless specifically addressed. It was straightforward, dignified, and ancient in its formality. Camilla nodded, confident that she understood. But as they prepared to begin the inspection, something shifted in Camilla's demeanor. Perhaps it was the weight of expectation, or maybe the desire to assert her authority in this overwhelmingly masculine space. She had spent years being compared to Diana. Years of feeling like an outsider in royal circles, years of criticism from the press and public. In that moment, standing before these soldiers, she wanted to demonstrate command. She turned to the nearest guardsman, a young man no more than 22, with clear blue eyes staring straight ahead. His name tag read Private Thompson, without consulting the colonel. Without following the established protocol, Camilla spoke in a voice that carried across the parade ground. "Guardsman, I want you to salute me now." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Colonel Hartwick's expression flickered with surprise, then concern. This was not how things were done. The rigid structure of military ceremony had been disrupted. Every soldier on that parade ground felt the shift, though none moved a muscle. Private Thompson's jaw tightened, almost imperceptibly. His training had prepared him for many situations, but this particular scenario had not been covered in any manual. He stood frozen, caught between his duty to obey a member of the royal family and his understanding of military protocol. The seconds stretched out. Camilla waited, her expression expectant, perhaps even slightly impatient. She had given what she believed was a reasonable command. In her mind, as queen consort, she had the authority to request a salute. What she had not fully grasped was the deep significance of the military salute itself. Margaret, standing several paces behind, felt her stomach drop. She had witnessed enough royal engagements to know when something was going wrong, and this was definitely going wrong. She caught the eye of the colonel, who looked as though he had just aged 5 years in as many seconds. Private Thompson finally spoke, his voice respectful but firm, carrying the confidence of someone who knew he stood on solid ground. "Ma'am, with respect, I cannot do that." The refusal was polite but absolute. Camilla's smile faltered. She had not expected to be contradicted, certainly not in front of so many witnesses. Her cheeks began to color slightly, a flush creeping up from her neck. "I beg your pardon," she said, her voice rising slightly in pitch. "I am the queen consort, and I am asking you to salute." The colonel stepped forward quickly, attempting to smooth over the situation. But Private Thompson spoke again before he could intervene. The young guardsman's words would echo through palace corridors for months to come, and they would teach Camilla a lesson in humility that no amount of coaching could have provided. "Ma'am," he said, his eyes still fixed straight ahead, his tone measured and professional. "A military salute is not given on command. It is a mark of respect between military personnel, or from military to the sovereign as commander-in-chief. You are the queen consort, and I hold you in the highest respect, but I cannot salute you simply because you ask me to. It would dishonor the meaning of the salute itself." The parade ground was absolutely silent. 200 soldiers heard every word. Officers exchanged glances. This was unprecedented. A guardsman had just refused a direct request from the queen consort, and he had done so with such perfect military bearing and logical reasoning that no one could fault him. Camilla stood frozen, her mind racing. She had been so certain of her authority, so convinced that her position granted her this privilege. The realization that she had misunderstood something so fundamental crashed over her like a cold wave. Her face burned with embarrassment. She could feel the eyes of everyone present upon her. Colonel Hartwick, his voice gentle but educational, finally spoke. "Ma'am, if I may explain, the military salute is indeed reserved for specific circumstances. It is a tradition that dates back centuries, rooted in mutual respect within the chain of command. Private Thompson is correct in his understanding, and his refusal, though it may seem impertinent, actually upholds the very honor and discipline that makes our forces strong." Mila wanted the ground to open and swallow her whole. She had made a mistake, a very public mistake, born from a misunderstanding of protocol and perhaps an overreach of perceived authority. Every lesson Charles had tried to teach her, every gentle reminder about the delicate balance of royal privilege and proper conduct, suddenly made perfect sense. She looked at Private Thompson, really looked at him, and saw not defiance but dignity. He had not humiliated her intentionally. He had simply stood firm in his principles, something she had to respect, even as her ego smarted from the correction. The silence on the parade ground seemed to stretch into eternity. Camilla could feel her heart pounding in her chest, and she was acutely aware that her carefully applied makeup could not hide the deep flush that had spread across her face. Behind her, Margaret clutched her folder so tightly that her knuckles had turned white. This was the kind of moment that would be whispered about in palace corridors for years to come. Colonel Hartwick cleared his throat softly, attempting to give the queen consort a graceful exit from the situation. "Perhaps, Your Majesty, we should continue with the inspection as planned." His voice was diplomatic, offering her a chance to move forward and salvage what remained of the visit. But Camilla was not quite ready to move on. Something in Private Thompson's respectful defiance had struck a chord within her. She had spent so many years fighting for acceptance, for her place beside Charles, for the respect of the British people who had loved Diana so deeply. And here stood this young guardsman, barely out of his teens, who had just taught her a profound lesson about the difference between demanding respect and earning it. She took a deep breath, composing herself with the dignity that had been drilled into her through years of royal training. When she spoke again, her voice was softer, more thoughtful. "Private Thompson, I apologize. You were absolutely correct to refuse my request. I spoke out of ignorance, and you responded with integrity. That took courage." The young guardsman's eyes flickered with surprise, though his military bearing remained perfect. "Thank you, ma'am," he said simply. Colonel Hartwick's expression softened with relief. A crisis had been averted, and more importantly, the queen consort had shown grace in acknowledging her error. That would count for something in the tight-knit military community where word traveled fast. Camilla continued the inspection. But the atmosphere had changed. Where before there had been stiff formality, there was now something more genuine. She asked soldiers about their families, their training, their hopes for their careers. She listened when they answered, really listened, rather than simply waiting for her turn to speak. When she reached a sergeant with graying hair and a chest full of medals, she paused. "How long have you served?" she asked. 28 years, ma'am," he replied, pride evident in his voice. "Then you've seen many changes, I imagine," Camilla said thoughtfully. "And you've probably witnessed more than a few royals making mistakes during inspections." The sergeant's lips twitched with the hint of a smile. "I couldn't possibly comment, ma'am." Camilla laughed, and the sound was genuine, unforced. Several soldiers nearby visibly relaxed. The tension that had gripped the parade ground began to dissipate like morning fog under the sun. As the inspection concluded, Colonel Hartwick guided her to his office for the traditional tea that followed such events. The room was lined with photographs of past military ceremonies, and Camilla found herself studying them with new eyes. In one image, she recognized a young King Charles, then Prince of Wales, standing with a group of servicemen. His posture was relaxed, his smile genuine. He had always understood this world better than she did. "Colonel," Camilla said as she accepted a cup of tea, "I wonder if you might help me understand something. Why exactly is the salute so significant? I thought I understood, but today has shown me I did not." The colonel settled into his chair, pleased to see genuine curiosity rather than wounded pride. "The salute, ma'am, is fundamentally about mutual respect and recognition of shared service. When a soldier salutes another, they are acknowledging that both wear the uniform. Both have taken the oath. Both stand ready to defend the realm. It is not something that can be commanded from outside that bond." "And the sovereign?" Camilla asked. "The sovereign is different," the colonel explained. "As commander-in-chief, His Majesty stands at the apex of the military structure. We salute the crown, the institution, the continuity of service across generations. But even then, the salute is offered, not demanded. It is given freely out of respect for what the crown represents." Camilla absorbed this, her tea growing cool in her hands. "So when I demanded that Private Thompson salute me, I was asking him to perform an act that had no meaning in the context I created." "Precisely, ma'am. And worse, you were asking him to cheapen something he holds sacred. That young man will one day salute comrades who may not come home from deployment. He will salute fallen heroes at military funerals. The gesture carries weight, history, sacrifice. To perform it on command without the proper context would diminish all of that." The full weight of her error settled on Camilla's shoulders. This was not about her authority being questioned. This was about her failing to understand something fundamental about the people she was meant to serve and honor. She thought of Charles, who had served in the Royal Navy, who understood the military mindset in a way she never could. Why hadn't she consulted him more thoroughly? Why had she assumed her position alone granted her understanding? "I have embarrassed myself today," she said quietly. "And worse, I have embarrassed His Majesty." Colonel Hartwick shook his head firmly. "Ma'am, if I may speak frankly, you have done neither. You made a mistake, yes, but you acknowledged it with grace. You showed humility. Do you know how rare that is? I have served under officers who would have punished Private Thompson for refusing, who would have doubled down on their error rather than admit fault. You did the opposite. That shows character." Margaret, who had been sitting quietly in the corner, nodded in agreement. "The colonel is right, ma'am. How you handled the aftermath says far more about you than the initial mistake." But Camilla was not entirely consoled. She knew that by evening, the story would have reached the palace. Charles would hear about it, probably from multiple sources, each account slightly different, possibly exaggerated. The press might get wind of it, and they were never kind to her. Even after all these years, the drive back to Windsor was quiet. Camilla stared out the window, watching London pass by, her mind replaying the scene on the parade ground over and over. She imagined the soldiers in the mess hall, discussing what had happened. Would they laugh at her? Would they see her as foolish, as someone who had married into royalty, but did not truly understand it? When she arrived at the castle, Charles was waiting for her in the private sitting room. His expression was neutral, which she had learned over the years meant he had heard something. Concerning Anne was waiting to hear her side before reacting. I understand there was an incident at the barracks. Today, he said carefully. Camilla sank into a chair. Suddenly, exhausted. You could call it that. I made a fool of myself, Charles. I demanded that a guardsman salute me, not understanding that I had no right to make such a demand. He refused politely, but firmly, and explained why. In front of 200 soldiers and half a dozen officers, she expected disappointment, perhaps even anger. Charles took protocol seriously, and errors reflected on the entire royal family. But when she looked up at him, she saw something different in his eyes. Understanding, perhaps even sympathy. Did you apologize? He asked immediately. And did you learn from it? More than I can possibly express. Charles sat down beside her and took her hand. Then you handled it exactly right. Camilla, do you know how many mistakes I made in my early years? How many times I said the wrong thing, misunderstood protocol, offended someone without meaning to? The difference between a good royal and a great one is not never making mistakes. It is how you respond when you do. But everyone will hear about this, Camilla said miserably. The press will have a field day, perhaps Charles acknowledged. Or perhaps the story that spreads will be about a queen consort who admitted error with grace, who treated a young guardsman with respect even after he refused her, who showed that she values integrity over pride. That is not a bad story to have told about you. Camilla wanted to believe him, but the embarrassment still burned. She had wanted so badly to prove herself, to show that she belonged in this role. And instead, she had revealed her ignorance in the most public way possible. The following morning, Camilla woke with a sense of dread. She reached for her phone on the bedside table, half expecting to see headlines mocking her mistake plastered across every news outlet. Charles was already awake, sitting in the adjacent room with his morning tea and newspapers spread before him. She could hear the rustle of pages turning, and braced herself for the worst. When she joined him, still in her dressing gown, he looked up with a neutral expression. You might want to see this, he said, sliding a newspaper across the table. Camilla's hands trembled slightly as she picked it up. The headline read, Queen Consort Shows Grace Under Pressure at Military Inspection. She blinked in surprise and began reading. The article, rather than mocking her, actually praised her response to the incident. It quoted an anonymous military source who spoke of her humility and willingness to admit error, describing these as qualities that resonated deeply with service personnel. I don't understand, she murmured. I expected them to tear me apart. Charles smiled gently. The military community is tight-knit, Camilla. When one of their own is treated with respect, word spreads. Colonel Hartwick apparently made several calls yesterday evening, ensuring that the proper context was provided to anyone asking about the incident. And Private Thompson himself gave a brief statement to his commanding officer, which was shared appropriately. Indeed, Private Thompson's account had been remarkably generous. He had emphasized the Queen Consort's grace in acknowledging her mistake, her genuine interest in the soldiers during the rest of the inspection, and her willingness to learn. His words carried weight precisely because they came from the person who had been at the center of the incident. But not all coverage was positive. One tabloid had managed to get hold of the story and had spun it differently, with a headline screaming, New Queen Already Breaking Protocol. The article was filled with thinly veiled criticisms, comparing her unfavorably to other royals, suggesting she was not fit for her role. Camilla read it with a sinking heart. This was what she had feared, the narrative she had spent years trying to overcome. No matter what she did, there would always be those who saw her as the interloper. The woman who had broken up a fairy tale marriage, someone who could never measure up to Diana's memory. Margaret arrived mid-morning with the daily schedule and a stack of correspondence. Among the letters was an envelope with the official seal of the household cavalry. Camilla opened it with curiosity and found a handwritten note from Colonel Hartwick. "Your Majesty," it read, "I wanted to personally thank you for your visit yesterday and for the grace with which you handled an awkward situation. Private Thompson has asked me to convey his deepest respect and to assure you that he bears no ill will. In fact, the men have been discussing your visit quite positively. They appreciate authenticity and humility, and you displayed both. Should you wish to visit again, we would be honored to host you." The note was signed with a flourish, and beneath the colonel's signature was a postscript. P.S. Even the late Queen Elizabeth made her share of protocol errors in the early years. What matters is not perfection, but character. Camilla felt tears prick her eyes. She had expected condemnation, and instead found understanding. She folded the letter carefully and placed it in her private desk drawer, knowing she would return to it often in the difficult days ahead. Over the following weeks, something unexpected happened. The incident, rather than defining her negatively, became a turning point in how certain segments of the public perceived her. Letters began arriving at the palace, many from veterans and military families, expressing appreciation for a royal who could admit mistakes. One letter particularly moved her, written by a retired sergeant who had served for 40 years. "Your Majesty," he wrote, "I spent my entire career watching royals and politicians visit our bases. Most treated us as props for photographs, going through the motions without genuine engagement. Your mistake was honest, and your response was honorable. Those two qualities matter more to military people than perfection ever could. We respect courage, and it takes courage to admit when you are wrong." Camilla shared the letter with Charles over dinner one evening. He read it thoughtfully, then looked at her with pride. "You are finding your way," he said simply. "Not by trying to be someone else, not by following a script perfectly, but by being authentically yourself, mistakes and all." But the incident had also sparked something deeper in Camilla. She realized how much she still had to learn about the institutions and traditions she was now part of. She began a quiet campaign of education, meeting privately with military historians, attending lectures at the Royal Military Academy, and spending time with veterans organizations. She invited Private Thompson to a private tea at the palace, much to his astonishment. When he arrived, clearly nervous in his dress uniform, she greeted him warmly and immediately put him at ease. "Private Thompson," she said, "I wanted to thank you personally for your integrity that day. You taught me an important lesson, and you did so with respect and dignity. I hope you have not suffered any negative consequences." Young guardsman shook his head. "Not at all, ma'am. If anything, the opposite. My commanding officers have commended me for upholding military values, and my mates have been quite supportive." They talked for nearly an hour, and Camilla asked him about his life, his family, his reasons for joining the military. She learned that he came from a long line of soldiers, that his grandfather had served in World War II. That military service was not just a job for him, but a calling. She began to understand the depth of tradition and meaning that she had unknowingly trampled upon with her careless demand when he left. Private Thompson felt something he had not expected to feel toward the Queen. Consort, genuine respect, and even a touch of admiration. He had entered the palace expecting a formal, uncomfortable meeting, perhaps even a subtle reprimand disguised as tea. Instead, he had found someone genuinely interested in understanding her mistake and learning from it. Back at the barracks, his account of the tea spread quickly. The narrative among the soldiers shifted. The Queen Consort was not perfect, but she was real. She made mistakes, but she owned them. In a world of carefully curated royal images and scripted appearances, that authenticity was refreshing. Meanwhile, Camilla continued her education. She attended a Remembrance Day service with new eyes, watching as soldiers saluted fallen comrades, seeing the emotion and reverence in those simple gestures. She understood now what she had asked Private Thompson to cheapen with her ignorant demand. She also began to pay closer attention to the subtle dynamics of royal protocol. She noticed how Catherine seemed to navigate military events with such ease, how she knew instinctively when to speak and when to remain silent, how she showed respect without overstepping. Camilla had initially felt envious of Catherine's natural grace, but now she saw it as something to learn from rather than compete with. One afternoon, she invited Catherine for tea in her private sitting room. The younger woman arrived with her characteristic poise, and they talked about the challenges of royal life, the constant scrutiny, the impossible standards. "I heard about the incident at the barracks," Catherine said gently. "For what it's worth, I think you handled it beautifully." Camilla smiled ruefully. "I made a fool of myself." "You made a mistake," Catherine corrected. "There's a difference. I've made plenty of my own, though perhaps not quite so public. The key is what you do afterward, and from what I understand, you turned a potential disaster into a teaching moment. That takes strength." The two women, who had sometimes circled each other warily in the complex dynamics of royal hierarchy, found common ground in that conversation. They were both, in their own ways, trying to navigate roles that came with impossible expectations and constant judgment. As the weeks turned into months, the incident at the barracks began to fade from immediate public consciousness, but its impact on Camilla remained. She approached her royal duties with more humility, more willingness to ask questions, and more genuine curiosity about the people and institutions she encountered. She also developed a thicker skin regarding press criticism. The tabloid that had mocked her continued to do so regularly, but she learned to differentiate between legitimate criticism and pointless cruelty. Not every negative article required a response or a change in behavior. Some were simply the background noise of royal life, to be acknowledged and then ignored. One day, several months after the incident, she was invited to another military event, this time at the Royal Air Force Base. As she walked across the tarmac with the commanding officer, she noticed a young pilot standing at attention. Without thinking, she smiled at him and nodded respectfully. Acknowledging his service without demanding any gesture in return, the pilot, recognizing her and perhaps having heard the story of the barracks incident, snapped into a crisp salute, his face showing genuine respect. Camilla was surprised and touched by the gesture. She had not demanded it, had not expected it, and it meant more than any forced salute could have. The commanding officer noticed the exchange and smiled. "You've earned that, ma'am," he said quietly. "That salute was offered freely, and there is no greater honor." Camilla understood then what she had not grasped that day on the parade ground. Respect, like a military salute, could not be demanded or commanded. It had to be earned through actions, through character, through the daily work of showing up and trying to do better. A year had passed since the incident at the Household Cavalry Barracks, and Camilla found herself once again preparing for a military engagement. This time, however, her preparation was different. She sat with Charles in his study, asking detailed questions about the regiment she would be visiting, their history, their current deployments, and the proper way to acknowledge their service. Charles watched her with quiet satisfaction. The transformation in his wife over the past year had been remarkable. She approached her duties now with a confidence born not from assumption of authority, but from genuine knowledge and respect. She had earned her place, slowly and sometimes painfully, but authentically, Charles said, putting down the briefing papers. "I think that day at the barracks might have been one of the best things that could have happened to you." Camilla looked up in surprise. Being publicly corrected by a 22-year-old guardsman was a good thing. Being publicly corrected and handling it with grace was a very good thing, Charles clarified. It showed everyone, including yourself, who you really are. Not the caricature the tabloids paint, not the nervous woman trying too hard to fit in, but someone with genuine character and humility. Camilla considered this. The past year had indeed changed her. She no longer approached royal duties with the anxious need to prove herself. She had learned that perfection was impossible and that authenticity was far more valuable. The incident that had seemed like such a catastrophe at the time had actually freed her from the prison of trying to be flawless. She had also developed real relationships within the military community, Colonel Hartwick had become something of a mentor, helping her understand military culture and protocol. She regularly corresponded with veterans organizations and had become a patron of several military charities. The work felt meaningful in a way that many royal duties did. Not Private Thompson had been promoted to Lance Corporal and had written to thank her for the recommendation that Colonel Hartwick had submitted on his behalf. The recommendation had come from Camilla herself, who would quietly ask the colonel to recognize the young man's integrity and courage. It was a small gesture, but one that meant a great deal to Thompson and his family. The day's engagement was at a military hospital, where wounded veterans were receiving treatment. As Camilla walked through the wards, she spoke with soldiers who had lost limbs in combat, young men and women dealing with traumatic injuries, both physical and psychological. She listened to their stories without rushing, asked about their recovery, and inquired about their families. One veteran, a sergeant who had lost both legs in an explosion, spoke frankly about the challenges of adapting to civilian life. "It's not just the physical stuff, ma'am," he said. "It's losing that sense of purpose, that brotherhood. You go from being part of something bigger than yourself to being alone with your thoughts and your injuries." Camilla sat with him for a long time, not offering empty platitudes, but simply bearing witness to his experience. When she finally rose to leave, the sergeant said something that would stay with her forever. "You're all right. You are," he said with a slight smile. "You don't pretend to understand what you don't understand, and you don't try to fix things that can't be fixed. You just listen. That's rare." In the car on the way back to the palace, Camilla reflected on his words. She thought about the person she had been a year ago, so desperate to be accepted, so afraid of making mistakes that she had made them more spectacularly. She thought about the lesson Private Thompson had taught her about the difference between demanding respect and earning it. That evening, she attended a state dinner where she found herself seated next to a retired general, who had served with distinction for 40 years. Over the course of the meal, he mentioned that he had heard about the incident at the barracks. "I must tell you, ma'am," he said, his weathered face crinkling with a smile. "That story has made the rounds in military circles. It's become something of a teaching moment." Camilla felt a flutter of the old embarrassment. "I imagine I'm used as an example of what not to do." The general shook his head firmly. "Quite the opposite. You're used as an example of grace under pressure, of the courage it takes to admit error, and of the importance of treating soldiers with respect regardless of rank. Young officers are told your story to remind them that true leadership is not about never making mistakes, but about how you respond when you do." Camilla was genuinely surprised. What she had seen as her greatest humiliation had somehow become a story of positive leadership. The general continued, warming to his subject. "See, ma'am, we've had plenty of royals and politicians visit military bases over the years. Most come with their handlers, follow a script, shake a few hands, and leave. They never really engage with us. But you engaged. You made a mistake because you tried to connect in a way you didn't yet understand. And when corrected, you didn't retreat behind protocol or rank. You listened, learned, and changed. That's the kind of leadership we try to instill in our officers." Later that night, as Camilla prepared for bed, she stood before her mirror and thought about the journey of the past year. The woman looking back at her was different from the one who had demanded that salute. She was more confident, but less arrogant, more knowledgeable, but more aware of what she didn't know. More comfortable in her role, but less concerned with perfection. Charles came to stand beside her, and she leaned against him gratefully. "Do you remember," she said softly, "when you told me that the difference between a good royal and a great one was how they responded to mistakes?" "I do." "I'm not sure I'm a great royal," Camilla said, "but I'm becoming a better one. And oddly enough, it was a 22-year-old guardsman who set me on that path." Charles smiled. "Private Thompson, now Lance Corporal Thompson. I hear he's doing quite well." "He is. And I owe him a debt of gratitude." Several months later, Camilla was invited to present awards at a military ceremony. Among the recipients was Lance Corporal Thompson, who was being recognized for exceptional performance and leadership potential. When his name was called, he marched forward with perfect precision, his uniform impeccable, his bearing proud, as Camilla pinned the medal to his chest. She spoke quietly so that only he could hear. "Thank you, Lance Corporal Thompson, for your service, for your integrity, and for teaching an old woman a valuable lesson." Thompson's eyes flickered with emotion, and he responded in an equally quiet voice. "It was my honor, ma'am. You taught me something too that day. You taught me that true nobility isn't about rank or title. It's about character." He stepped back and saluted, not because he was commanded to, but because he genuinely wanted to honor her. Camilla felt a warmth spread through her chest. This salute, freely given, born of mutual respect, meant more than any number of demanded gestures could have. The ceremony continued. But Camilla's thoughts kept returning to that day on the parade ground. What had seemed like the end of her credibility had actually been the beginning of something more meaningful. She had learned that you cannot demand respect from people. You can only earn it through consistent actions and genuine character. In the years that followed, the story of the Queen Consort and the Guardsmen became part of royal lore, told and retold in military academies and leadership courses. It was a story about protocol and tradition, but more importantly, it was a story about humility, growth, and the courage to admit when you are wrong. Camilla continued to visit military bases and hospitals, to write to service members and their families, and to advocate for veterans' causes. She approached each engagement with the knowledge that her title granted her access, but only her actions would grant her respect. She had learned that lesson on a parade ground in front of 200 witnesses, and she would never forget it. Private Thompson, now Major Thompson with a distinguished career behind him, would occasionally tell the story himself when asked about memorable moments from his service. He always ended it the same way. "The Queen Consort could have had me disciplined. She could have insisted on being right. Instead, she apologized, learned, and changed." That's real leadership. That's something worth saluting in palace corridors. When new staff members expressed nervousness about making mistakes in their duties, they were sometimes told about the day the Queen Consort demanded a salute and received instead a lesson in humility. The story was told not to mock, but to reassure, to remind everyone that mistakes were part of growth, and that grace in acknowledging error was more valuable than perfection. Camilla, yes, herself kept Colonel Hartwick's letter in her desk drawer, taking it out occasionally when she faced particularly difficult challenges or harsh criticism. The note reminded her that character was built not in moments of triumph, but in moments of humiliation. Not when everything went right, but when things went spectacularly wrong. On the first anniversary of the incident, Camilla received a package delivered to the palace. Inside was a framed photograph of the household cavalry on parade, and beneath it, a small plaque with an inscription: "Respect is earned, not commanded." With gratitude from the soldiers who witnessed grace under pressure, it was signed by Private Thompson and countersigned by dozens of soldiers who had been present that day. Camilla hung it in her private sitting room, where it remained for the rest of her life. A constant reminder of one of the most important lessons she ever learned about power, protocol, and what it truly means to lead with dignity. The incident at the barracks had lasted only a few minutes, but its impact echoed through years. It changed how Camilla approached her role, how the military community viewed her, and how she understood the delicate balance between authority and humility. In the end, the moment of deep embarrassment had become a foundation for genuine respect, proving that sometimes our greatest mistakes lead to our most important growth. And somewhere, in barracks and bases across the United Kingdom, young soldiers still heard the story of the day. A Queen Consort learned that true respect, like a military salute, cannot be commanded into existence. It must be earned, freely given, and based on mutual recognition of character and integrity. That lesson, taught by a young guardsman to a woman who would be queen, remained one of the most valuable in both of their lives.